In this video, we're going to talk about making great swatches and how to get past some of the tricky things you might encounter when you're knitting a swatch. And before we get into it, I will talk for just a few seconds about the importance of knitting swatches. I've talked about this so many times before, but a swatch is a little bit of knitting that you do using the yarn and needles that you're going to use for any given project so that you can measure the number of stitches that you're getting per inch. And that's your tension. And ultimately, you want your tension to match that in the pattern so that your finished item will end up being the correct size, or the size that the pattern, the sizes that the pattern lists out. Now, it doesn't make much difference if you're not swatching for things like scarves and shawls and blankets, because if your item ends up being a bit bigger or a bit smaller than the pattern, scarves and blankets are still useful, even if they're a little bit of a different size. But if you're knitting something that needs to fit, like a sweater or a cap or gloves or mittens or even a tea cozy, you want your tension to be the same as the pattern so that your thing ends up being the right size. A sweater might have a pattern, the neckline's like this, and if your gauge is off, your neckline could be like this, then that's a problem. And every time I talk about swatches, there's always somebody who speaks up and says, "Oh, I never bother with swatches and my knitting always ends up just fine." Well, that person either doesn't knit very many things that need to fit, or they are the luckiest person in the world, because there is no standards for the tension in a pattern. It's really just based on what the pattern designer has for their own personal gauge tension. So that's why swatches are important. Enough of that. First, let's talk about swatching in the round versus flat swatching. Ultimately, if you're knitting something that's knit in the round, like in a tube, like a top-down seamless sweater, the most accurate swatch you can knit is going to be knit in the round. And I personally don't notice any difference between my flat knitting and my knitting in the round, so I don't really mess with this, but you can test it out for yourself to see if there is a difference in your flat knitting and knitting in the round. Well, before I show you what I have here, if you're knitting a sweater, you can always start on a small piece of the sweater, like knitting the sleeve, and have that be your swatch. Just measure your tension on that. The reason people don't get excited about swatching in the round is because you have to cast on so many more stitches and your swatch just uses more yarn and takes more time. If you're knitting something small like a mitten or a hat, it's usually best just to cast on that item because it's already kind of a small thing and your swatch is essentially going to be the same size. Let's go ahead and take a look for one solution I have for swatching in the round flat. Here we have, it's not very pretty, but this is a way of knitting in the round and flat at the same time. You don't have to cast on very many stitches. And the way that this works is this. I am only knitting right side rows and never turning it to knit a wrong side row and just having these giant floats on the back. My working yarn is coming from this stitch over here, and I'm going to knit this stitch next. So, slide my needles over to the side and pull the working yarn all the way from over here. Put the needle in, wrap it and pull it through. And then you want to make sure your float is loose, so you can go ahead and give your floats a tug to make sure it matches the other ones there. And then knit across. And you just keep doing that for each row until you get enough so that you can actually measure your stitches per inch. The fact with this method is you're going to have some really goofy tension on your edge stitches. And that's just kind of the nature of the beast with this. So make sure you cast on enough stitches so that you don't have to count these edge stitches in your swatch. I want to get to the end of this row and show you what happens at the end. Okay, I'm at the end of the row. I slide everything over to the other needle so that my working yarn is coming from this stitch here, and then I float it across the back again, and you keep doing that. Most patterns are going to have you cast on and knit a swatch in stockinette stitch, and that's what I have here. I like to knit my stockinette swatches with a garter stitch border because stockinette curls up so much it can be different to get a measurement on your stitches per inch while it's curling up. And the way that I do this is I look at the pattern and it will say X number of stitches over 4 inches or 10 centimeters. And for this swatch, it was 22 stitches. So I cast on 22 stitches plus 10, and that's 5 stitches in garter stitch here and 5 stitches in garter stitch here. And I knit 5 ridges of garter stitch. That's knit every row. It's a cast on plus 9 rows. And then keeping all the edge stitches in knit and purling the wrong side row here. I'll give you exact instructions on how to make swatches like this in the video description field below, as well as on my website, because this makes it really easy to measure. I cast on my stitches, I can measure across. I am absolutely getting gauge. There's 4 inches. I'm getting, I was getting row gauge as well. Maybe I'm not quite getting row gauge, a little short on row gauge. But stitch gauge is perfect. And I can also show you 10 centimeters. It looks good too. I should tell you, you're going to see a lot of swatches here. These swatches are all made with Australian Superfine Merino by Cleckheaton. It's a new yarn I just discovered. It is beautiful. You can see the stitch definition is so nice in this yarn. It comes in 30 different colors. It also is super fine, and that means that it's ideal for wearing next to the skin, ideal for garments, which is perfect for this swatching video because swatching is so important with garments. One thing I want to show you, I forgot. So after I knit one of these swatches, I want to be sure to keep track of the needle size that I used. So in this swatch, I used a size 6 needle. So in the tail end, I tie 6 little knots in the yarn. And I can run my hand over that and count 6 knots so I know exactly how many, I know exactly what needle size I used for this. And that helps me remember. Another way to keep track of that is in this garter stitch sample. I have these yarn over holes. I have 7 yarn over holes because I used size 7 needle. Let me put this on a white background. It might be easier to see. See the yarn over holes there? What I did was yarn over, knit 2 together, yarn over, knit 2 together, yarn over, knit 2 together. I knit a yarn over and a knit 2 together to get up to the needle size that I used. And I wanted to show you this garter stitch swatch because this is the other most common swatch that you'll need to knit. And you don't need to knit a border on a garter stitch swatch because it won't curl up. You can just knit it, cast on the number over 4 inches, and then measure that. And I'm getting gauge here perfectly. If you're getting too many stitches per inch, you want to go up a needle size so your stitches are bigger so you get few of them per inch. If you're getting too few stitches per inch, you want to go down a needle size so your stitches are smaller so more of them will fit in an inch. Now another tricky thing is when you're knitting in a pattern. And the pattern might say, a stitch pattern. The pattern might say, it's X number of stitches in the cable twist pattern, which is what I'm pretending we have here. And it can be hard because it's difficult to count the stitches when they're in a pattern. So the solution for this is, again, to cast on the number of stitches that should fit over 4 inches or 10 centimeters, and then wash and block your swatch. That means to wash it and then set it out flat to dry, and then measure. And here I am quite shy of 4 inches. In this case, I would want to go up, gosh, at least 2 needle sizes to get my stitches bigger so that this many stitches will fit over 4 inches. And that is far easier to measure it this way than to try to count each individual stitch when you have a complicated stitch pattern. It actually wouldn't be too tough with this specific example because I know it's 4 here and 1 here, but it can get tough. Well, I'll show you another example. I don't have to explain it. I have it right here. Here we have a lacy pattern, and yeah, counting the stitches in this would be tough. Not only is the eye drawn at an angle, a diagonal here, but yeah, what is that? So I cast on the number of stitches that should fit over 4 inches. I'm going to measure that, and I'm getting a bit over 4 inches. So in this case, I'd want to go down a needle size and knit another swatch and try to get it right on target. That's all I have for you on stellar swatches. More information on the yarn that I used in this video is in the video description field below, as well as on my website. Good luck.